Folks, today you're in for a treat. One of my favorite people in the entire world, Gaye Hammond, is joining us today on the podcast. Now, a few years ago when I was politicking for the American Rose Society, I flew out to Houston. Gaye picked me up, took me all over town, and she took me to the MD Anderson Cancer Research Facility where they have a healing garden and a rose trial there. And one of the things we talked about on that trip was getting your soil right. And I'm so glad that she's joining us today to take us all to class. Y'all stay with us. The Rose Chat podcast starts now.
It's time for the Rose Chat podcast, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the world's most beloved flower, the rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris Van Cleef and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Try Haven brand soil conditioners, providing generations of gardeners with a truly all-natural alternative to chemical fertilizers with their line of composted manure and alfalfa teas. Easy to brew and use on all indoor and outdoor plants. Find them online at manuretea.com.
Hey friends, today we're joined by Gaye Hammond to get all the dirt on soil. Now, Gaye has been in leadership positions in the Houston Rose Society for many years, and she's helped them to become one of the most successful societies in the country. Gaye is a life member and patron of the American Rose Society and serves on the marketing committee. She is also the study liaison between the Houston Rose Society and Texas A&M Agri-Life Extension Service in connection with the Earthkind Rose research. And I'm telling you, she does so much more. Hey, Gaye, welcome to Rose Chat.
Good Saturday morning to you.
So good to have you. You know, we're going to start with the basics. I mean, you can't get any more basic than soil. But how important is having the right soil?
Well, what I tell people when I speak around the country is it doesn't matter what plants you buy, how cheap or how expensive. If you don't have the right soil for it to grow in, you're not going to be successful with that plant no matter what it is. So it is the top priority when it comes to having a successful garden. And what I find is when I interview people is they don't pay a lot of attention to it typically. They tend to either put most of their money into their plants or they fall into the group of people, and this is a big group that believe that improving their soil is too expensive. It's too time consuming, and they think it's too much labor, and so they don't do it. And just this week, I had a wonderfully sweet lady send me an email, and she had spent $63 to buy one plant, one rose bush, which I thought was kind of ridiculous. And she planted it, and didn't bloom. She started having canes die, and I said, send me a picture of that bush. She had gone out in her yard, in her typical residential subdivision turf, dug a hole, probably in clay, dropped the bush in it, and then put the clods of clay back on top of the bush and expected it to survive. And it didn't. Not surprising. And so if you fall into either camp where you think soil's not important or it's too labor intensive, you're going to have disappointing results. No matter what your intentions are. Because plants are a lot like people. They want a nice place to live and they want good food to eat. And if they get those two things, they're going to be happy. And happy plants produce flowers and fruit. And so that's our goal, is to produce beautiful flowers. And if you're a gardener of multiple types of plants that are food crops, you're going to be happy as well as your plants are going to be happy. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I've got the most horrible soil, and I've been told I need to dig it all out and haul it off and get something new. Well, that's just not true. Every type of soil, no matter how bad it is, can be improved. And people run into just as many problems when they dig out their native soil and they bring in something new. They typically bring in a different type of problem with their new soil. So rest assured that no matter what type of soil you have, I can help you make it better. So what does it do? The soil has one big job, and that is to be the storehouse for nutrients that the plant is going to need to be successful. It will also anchor the roots of the plant in the soil, and it will be the transition for how to get those nutrients into the plant. So it has a lot of uses, and it needs a minimum of care, ironically, once you set the process up right. And when I look at soils, a lot of times soils don't have everything that they need in their native form for good plant growth. They need good soil, has minerals, which are nothing more than tiny fragments of rock that have decomposed over time or disintegrated over time. Organic matter, which is decomposing plants and insect remains in various stages of decay. Your soil is going to be either clay, sand, or loam. A lot of people don't know what those three things are. And the percentage of those ingredients identify what type of soil you have. So loam, which I think only exists in heaven in Tyler, Texas, is the best because it's a mix of sand and clay. And it drains well, and it's easy to work. And that's why you have, in agricultural areas, soils are typically loam soils. In residential areas, soils are typically clay, which are nasty and sticky and gummy, and you hate to work them, and then you hate scraping all that clay off of your tools at the end of the day. And so clay is really hard to manage from a landscape perspective. But no matter what you have, it's always going to be more economical to improve your native soil instead of digging it all out, hauling it all off, and getting something new.
Gaye, as you're talking, do you remember Rayford Riddell?
I do, very well. He used to be a member of our society.
Was he really? Well, I had his book back in the day, read it religiously, and he made a VHS tape called Growing Great Roses, and I watched it over and over. But one of the quotes, I don't remember the exact quote, that he was famous for saying is, don't put a 10-bit rose in a 2-bit hole.
That is so true. It actually goes the opposite way.
Exactly.
When you look at designing a landscape, most of your money, as far as percentages, goes into creating the space than the cost of the plant. Absolutely. And so if we remember that, the better we improve the soil, the better the plant is going to be, then we start with the right mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, so in making all these decisions, how important do you think it is? Is it really worth it to get a soil test?
Well, here's my approach. Up until I started working with Texas A&M, I didn't know what a soil test was. Now, when people send me problems, and usually from 5:30 in the morning until 8:30 in the morning, at my office, I answer questions for people from around the country who first lead-off question is, what's wrong with my rose? And if the problem is not readily apparent as a disease or an insect, I go to the soil. And what I find is only 1 out of 40 even know what a soil test is either. and so, because soil tests are not at the grocery store or the box store on the shelf, they don't know how to get it. It's not well marketed anywhere in the country. No. It's kind of an afterthought for horticultural universities as a service that they sell, but normal people don't know what that is. And so usually I find that, 3 times so far in July this happened. People had undiagnosable to them problems. I said, let's get a soil test and see what it said. And in every case, the nutrient balance of the soil was so out of whack that it's amazing that the plant grew anything at all. And so the soil test is critical if you don't know what the nutrient levels in your planting medium is to begin with. So it's always a good baseline test. And the reason why that's true is that human nature is such that if the plant's not doing well, we think there's not enough fertilizer or water. And so we feed the plants and we give them more water. And at the end of the day, we make the problem worse. Could have been very easy to solve, but now that we have complicated it because we didn't know what was wrong in the first place, we have a lot more challenges to try and overcome to get the plants back healthy. And perhaps this will give you a visual of why that's important. Back in 2000, I think it was 6, Texas A&M, in the Earth Kind Rose Research Program that I was involved in, we gave away soil test. For everybody that bought a Belinda's Dream Rose, they got a soil test. And the purpose was not to give away free soil test. It was to determine in Texas, what did the typical subdivision landscape look like chemically? And what we found was 89% of the time, the phosphorus level was so out of whack that if plants survived, they just didn't do well. 89% of the time. Now that's amazing. Mm. And so the soil test will tell you what to avoid or what you need. And it will certainly identify those landscapes that are out of whack, because you need to fix that before you can expect your plants to do what you want them to do. And let me make a clarification, because I don't want people to run out to their land-grant university and order up a soil test without knowing what they're going to get. Soil tests are not created equally. Some soil tests from some universities provide so little usable information that, in my opinion, it's a waste of money. And so I only recommend 2 universities for soil test, because I know they give good information that gardeners without any kind of expertise can understand. And those soil tests come from Oklahoma State University and Texas A&M. The best soil test asks you, what are you growing, or what are you trying to grow? And then they look at the chemical balance of the soil to say, are the components there that will support this plant so it can thrive? If the soil test doesn't ask you that question, whoever's reading the soil test is shooting in the dark. because they can't make a recommendation for you for roses if they didn't ask that fundamental question. So that's the kind of soil test that I recommend that people get. And the best soil test will take it even a step further. And they will say, to fix your imbalance, you need to add a certain amount of nitrogen. You don't want to add any phosphorus for the next 10 years. And it will be specific recommendations. Now, somebody may not know how to convert 1 pound of nitrogen per acre, but your tractor supplies or your agricultural operations, and a lot of times if you go online to the fertilizer MSDS sheet, which they all have to produce, that will convert it for the home gardener. So soil test is absolutely necessary as a baseline so you know what you're working with. And one of the things that we questioned when we did the research at Texas A&M on subdivision soils, and that told us that 89% of the time the phosphorus level was so high that plants probably wouldn't grow and they certainly wouldn't thrive. The follow-up question that we had is, why is this true? And one of the things that I did was to go to the local box store companies and look at the fertilizers that were on their shelf, and then look at their rose care products that were on their shelf. And while I was doing this exercise, my good friend who's the program chairman for the Houston Rose Society did a soil test, and her phosphorus level was 600 times what it should have been. Wow. And they recommended, do not apply a phosphorus-based product to your landscape for the next 15 years, because phosphorus just don't go away. And I said, when she got that, of course, she panicked because she's got 200 rose bushes. And she brought me her soil test, and I went over there and I said, let's look at what you've been putting on your garden. Every single product that she used, even products which weren't fertilizer, had phosphorus in them. So I went back to Texas A&M and I said, why are they putting phosphorus in these products? And through a long process, the hypothesis is phosphorus produces flowers, more vibrant color, and fruit. And manufacturers of plant products know this. And they know that if we see a plant and it looks sickly, we go out and buy something to treat that plant with, but we expect there to be more flowers, there to be better colors, and there to be more fruit. And so they put phosphorus in products that phosphorus probably shouldn't even be in, because that's how we judge where the product is working or not. And so if your phosphorus level is bumping up to the limit, you need to be real careful and read the labels to determine if there is phosphorus or a phosphate-based product in that label before you use it in your landscape, because you may be like my friend. She wasn't trying to add phosphorus to her landscape. She was just trying to make her plants look more healthy. And she inadvertently was putting phosphorus on when phosphorus wasn't needed. And so, for that reason, I am a big proponent of getting a baseline soil test to begin with, and then repeating that soil test every third year, as long as the plants aren't demonstrating some unusual problem, to make sure that you are keeping your soil balance in check and you don't have too much or too little of something, because soil tests are cheap. The last one I did at Texas A&M was $17, and I had the results in 3 days. And so I could have gone out and bought a $40 bag of something, or that I really didn't need, or do a $17 soil test and then figure out, oh, all I need is, a $6 can of Miracle-Gro and going about my business. So in the long run, knowing what you need and only applying what you need is much more economical and better for the plants.
Absolutely, absolutely. Such good advice. But now let's go a little deeper and talk about one of the concepts in gardening that you hear about that's a bit confusing, and that's pH.
You are so correct. Not only is it confusing, most people think it's scary. Because if you look in a book, no matter what kind of book it is, and the words pH, you have a page and a half of chemical terminology. And it makes no sense to most people, including me. So let me break it down to simple elementary English. pH is the equivalent of a door. And whether or not the plants can go through the door to get the nutrients on the other side depends on whether the door is open or closed. And pH is that door. If your pH balance is too high or too low for the plant you're trying to grow, the door can be locked and the plant can't get to the nutrients. If the pH is just right, the plant roots can go through the door, get the nutrients, they're happy. If the pH level is right, the earthworms are happy, the microorganisms are happy, but let that pH get a little too high or a little too low, stuff starts to happen. And the stuff is not, it's not like, oh, my pH is out, the red flag goes up. You have to do a little bit of research to figure that out. And once it is out of whack and the door locks, it takes time to get it unlocked. So, important to know that with a soil test, you're going to get a pH reading. That's one of the reasons why a soil test is so important. If we're growing roses like a pH at a level of 6 to 6.5. 7 is neutral. Below 7 is acid. Above 7 is alkaline. Different plants grow different depending on that level of pH. Roses like the acid side. Things like blueberries and azaleas, they like the alkaline side. So when you know that, you understand that if you try to grow blueberries in the same bed that you're growing roses in, it's just not going to work. You try to grow azaleas with roses, it's just not going to work because the pH requirement for both is much different. pH has a dark side. And if the pH is, for some nutrients, is way too high or has plummeted and is in Never Never Land, toxicity occurs and plants can actually be poisoned. Now, I've only seen that one time, and I'll explain how I saw it before so people don't fall into that trap. But it's important to know that you have to have a way to figure out, am I okay with my pH or not? Because whatever that determination is dictates which way you're going to go when it comes to amending your soil or feeding your plants, or it's going to have a whole lot to do with everything else that's going on. Where I've seen this get so far out of whack that plants did not survive was as part of this Let's Test the Soil program with Texas A&M. And there was a wonderfully sweet lady in Dallas, and her soil test came up with a phosphorus level, and the phosphorus level was 1,800 times higher than it should have been. And her pH level was 8.3. So roses shouldn't have been growing at all in her place. And because her phosphorus level was high, nothing should have been growing in her place. And so Texas A&M went out and asked her, may we test your soil again because we don't believe these results? And they did, and the second test came in consistent with the first. And so we went out and visited with this wonderfully sweet lady, and she had a very substantial home and grounds, and we started questioning her. And of course we said, your pH is such that it shouldn't look like this. Your phosphorus level tells us that your plant shouldn't even be alive. We don't understand why it looks like it looks. And she said, oh, well, I have a professional landscape company. And we're like, okay, they should know better than let this happen. But what do they do to minimize this? And she said, well, I don't know. They replace all my plants every 3 months. And the light bulb went off to all of us, except her. And we said, well, that answers the question. They're changing out the plants because they know they're going to die, and they don't want you to see them look that bad. And the next thing I know, she fires them, and she starts working with that Texas A&M, and to get her soil back in balance with a company that she could trust to not have to change out an 1.5 acres of plants every 3 months. Can you imagine that experience?
I just, and not questioning it. Oh my goodness, what a story.
Any better. And a lot of gardeners don't. They just say something's wrong with my plant. Well, really and truly, it's not something that's wrong with the plant. Plant's doing as good as it can do with what it's got. The problem rests with the soil, which is why we say most of the time, if the problem with the plant is not a visible pest or disease, it's a problem in the soil. And so the soil is easy to identify once we get a soil test with the pH reading, and we can tell where things lie and what we need to fix. Now, a lot of people will say, well, pH can change, and it absolutely can. And people ask me, well, can I go get one of those little soil meters, or those pH meters, or those pH test kits? Absolutely. I have a pH meter. And basically it's a little digital readout on a metal probe that's about 12 inches long. You stick the probe in the dirt, and then 2 minutes later you get a reading that says it's whatever it is. Those are good to give you a range. They are not 100% accurate. But if you test it and your pH is 6.2, that's close enough for growing roses. If it gives you a range, if it gives you a number that is what you think might be too high or too low for roses, that's when you would go get a confirmation by sending in a soil test to see if the soil test agrees with the meter. But if you're using a meter and it's coming into range for roses, that's good enough. You only would then have to go verify it with the soil test if your meter reading is out of range. And let me say a little bit about test kits, because that was the first thing I bought before there were ever meters. It's hard for some people to read a test kit, because is this really the green that it's supposed to be, or is it really the red, or is it kind of between red and yellow? So there's a lot of room for error if you use the little test strips as opposed to the meter reading, which gives you a digital readout. So I would not, if I'm a new gardener, use the kit. I would use a meter. Both of them are inexpensive, but it's a good place to start. And I have to give people one word of warning, because I see this happening a lot around the country. People tend to go out and get a soil test in the winter before the spring season comes, that they would start working in the garden in earnest. And that is the absolute wrong time to get a soil test or take a pH reading. And the reason is winter temperatures, which typically have more moisture in the soil, can increase the pH level to a false and give you a false reading. It will do the same thing if there is sodium in your soil or water. It can give you a false reading if you take those readings in the winter. So it's better to take your first soil test or your first pH reading when the soil is at least 70 degrees. And how do we know? Because that's always the follow-up. Amazingly enough, Tractor Supplies sell a soil thermometer. And they're about a foot long, and you stick them in the dirt, and you wait 10 minutes, and then it tells you how warm your soil is. So you don't want to do a lot of things with your garden, including take a soil test or take a pH reading, until that soil warms up to at least 70 degrees. And then you're safe.
So much good information. I don't know that I've heard maybe one time before someone talk about the winter readings or the early spring readings. And before we had something to take the temperature of the soil in earnest, I would always know when the soil would get around 50 degrees because the forsythia blooms. So I got that far, but 70, I'm not sure about that.
Well,
so
we're going to talk about why 70 is important in a minute. But
okay.
For the purpose of soil test and pH readings, you're better off waiting until it gets warmed up to 70.
Great. When you were talking about the soil kits and how that might not be the easiest thing for us to do, I'm reminded of a very contemporary story in our world today. And when we were in England, we had to do the Fit to Fly test. And we bought the test that they send to your home, and you get a kit. And you do it, and you're doing it via video. You're doing a Zoom video with someone who's telling you what to do. And through the whole process, I was just a little on edge. What if I do it wrong? I mean, I think it's a foolproof kit, and everything was, I got home and everything was great, but I felt very uncomfortable in the lab world. So I said, I think I'm different now. I feel like I'm a lab tech, and I'm not really comfortable there. So having someone else do this for you is much better for me, because that just threw me off my game a little bit.
Well, I have a soil pH meter, and I have a water meter, and that is usually in my own landscape. That is usually the thing that I do once a year, and just go to each bed to make sure that they're all similarly situated, and that I don't have any soil problem to start. And if I do, I know to take care of it early on so it doesn't affect whatever I'm going to plant throughout the growing season. So it's good insurance to have.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Now, I have the Kelway pH monitor, and I can tell you that last year I did professional soil test after I had used my Kelway, and it was really very close. What we found out is I was too alkali, and going to have to work on that. But the Kelway and my lab test were very similar, so that was good to know.
That is good, because a lot of times if you rely on one, if you rely on your home meter and you implement change, you may be implementing more change than necessary and send your soil pH in the opposite direction. And people always say, well, how do I know what to put? Well, if you get a soil test, your soil test will tell you need to add, if your pH is too high, you need to add sulfur. No, you need to add lime. I always get these backwards. And if it's too low, you need to add sulfur. And so in a soil test, it tells you how much. Mm-hmm. And so if you're doing it with a pH meter, you're kind of guessing. And it doesn't change overnight. It can take 2 to 3 months for you to apply corrective measures before you actually see the result. So it is possible to change that pH. It's just not going to happen as quick as Gaye would like it to happen, but it happens in Mother Nature's own time.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I live in Indiana where we have clay soil, and I loved your earlier description. I think you used the word icky.
Yeah.
And it gets wet, and it stays wet, and it's heavy. And so how can we improve it?
Well, there's 2 ways to improve soils. And we're going to primarily talk about clay and sand, because loam is loam, and it's usually good as it is. And this is tried and true. We've done this in my work with Texas A&M and the Earth Kind Rose Research Program all over the United States. So it doesn't matter where you do this, it's going to work. If you have, well, let me back up. A lot of people do not know whether their soil is clay or sand. Other people believe, like I did, clay, which holds water and does not drain well, versus sand, which drains like a colander. In my mind, before I knew better, I would think, well, if I take something that doesn't drain well and I mix it with something that does drain well, it's going to be like taking red food coloring and adding white food coloring and getting pink. I'm going to take the stuff that doesn't drain, I'm going to add the stuff that does drain, and it's going to combine and drain better than the clay would drain on its own. And that is so wrong. That makes concrete. And I did not understand that. And I was in Odessa, Texas, giving a 5-day lecture in school on earth kind, land management, and roses. And the professor giving the segment on improving soils, he kept saying, you cannot mix the two. You cannot mix the two. And I'm like, it doesn't make sense. This just does not make sense. And he said, well, this is the way it is. I said, it doesn't make sense. You have to show me why this is true. And so at 11:30 at night, we went to an all-night Walmart. And I said, okay, we're going to buy a gallon glass container. And that's going to be our hole that we're going to put our rose in. And I said, now go through this store and find me a product that would be equivalent, a visual equivalent of a grain of sand. And so he bought a gallon of tennis balls. Now I have a gallon jar. I have a gallon of tennis balls. Put the tennis balls in the gallon jar. What do I have? I got big spaces and gaps between those balls. That's why sand drains so well. It's got big holes between the grains of sand, just like the big holes between the tennis balls. I said, now, give me a product, find a product that we can buy a gallon of that would be the equivalent of clay. And he bought some red BBs. He bought a gallon of red BBs. And so we have our glass jar. It has a gallon of tennis balls, which are sand. He poured the whole gallon of red BBs in the jar full of tennis balls, and they fit. And the BBs went to all the holes between the sand. Now, I have much poorer drainage because the jar is more compact. And he said, Gaye, he said, if I add silt to this, silt is finer than the BBs, much finer than the tennis balls. So he went and bought a 4-pound bag of sugar. And 3 pounds of the 4-pound bag of sugar fit in the 1-gallon glass container with the 1 gallon of tennis balls and the 1 gallon of BBs. And he got 3 pounds of sugar in that jar, and the drainage stopped. And so when you have clay and you have sand, the last thing you ever want to do is mix those two together. So how do we improve it? How do we make the clay where it drains better? And it is easier to work. The one way to do that is to till in 3 inches of fully aged plant-based compost, and then follow that with 3 inches of a product called expanded shale. And expanded shale is nothing more than shale rock chopped up into 1/4-inch pieces and run through a big oven that's 2,000 degrees, and those little shale particles pop like popcorn. And if you look at them under a microscope, they look like a sponge. And so by mixing those into that sticky, gummy, ill-draining clay, what happens is the water and the nutrients gravitate into these particles, these rock particles. And they hold there until the soil around the particle dries out, and then the water wicks away. And so it's that little reservoir that keeps the clay broken up and friable. It keeps it from being too wet. And it lasts forever. It does not go anywhere. It does not decompose. And so those 2 amendments to clay soil is the start of changing hard to work, horrible clay in its native form into something workable and that will support plants. Now, that's all you need to do. Nothing else. Sand. Only have to till in 3 inches of compost. Sand drains real well. In fact, it drains too well. In some cases, water drains through it before the roots can catch it. And so we need to incorporate something that will hold the water so that the plant roots can get it. And that is 3 inches of fully finished compost. Now, I always use the term fully finished. In a perfect world, that's what compost is. If you go to buy compost and the product is in a pile and you're buying it in bulk, if that pile is still smoking, it is not fully finished. Fully finished means it's like a cake and it's done. If it's still steaming, it's not done. It's still cooking. If you're buying it in bags and there's condensation inside the bags, it's still cooking. If you have no choice and that's what you have to get because that's all that's available, then the simple fix is to dump it in your driveway or in a secluded area in your yard on a tarp. and add some basic cheap 20-20-20 fertilizer to the pile, cover it up, let it stop smoking, and it'll be ready to use. If you put raw compost into your planting area, you're going to rob your soil of nitrogen, which is the number one thing that most soils are deficient of. And the nitrogen is going to go to breaking down the compost instead of going to your plants. So you want it to be fully finished. A lot of people will use barnyard manures. They've got cows, they've got horses, they've got sheep, they've got 4-H products. So they have a supply of manure-based products that they can compost. You just want to make sure that it's been composted long enough that the hayseed and the grass seed is dyed. But that is certainly, you can certainly use farmyard compost as well. Absent adding compost and for clay expanded shale, the only other thing that people need to do to improve their soil is to keep their planting beds covered all year with 3 inches of shredded mulch. And we'll talk about mulch a little bit more in a minute. But mulch is that component that keeps your soil temperature consistent. It keeps the moisture in the soil as opposed to evaporating, and it helps deter weeds. And so for improving your soil, whatever it is, for clay, 3 inches of expanded shale, 3 inches of compost. For sand, 3 inches of compost. And then top that with 3 inches of mulch. That's all you need to do. You don't need to go out and buy all kinds of fancy products. You don't need 75 bags of different stuff. These 3 things will do the job in any kind of soil that you have.
Boy, that is so true. You know, I love it that, you know, the problem seems so vast, but the fix is pretty easy.
The fix is pretty easy. And if you stop and think, and I have doubting Thomases every time I give this program, but what about this newest product? In fact, I had one where a wonderful lady was sitting in the back, and the more I talked, the higher her arms got crossed under her armpits. And you could tell that about 10 minutes before the program was over, her head was going to blow off. And so I called on her, and I said, I can't help but recognize you have something to say. Can we hear it? And she said, well, you're not talking about this product that was on the TV, last week, or this new thing. And I said, you're right. I'm not. And, well, why not? We need to hear about those. I said, why? If this fixes the problem, why do you need to go out and buy all those other things? And she went, well, I don't. And I said, exactly. And of course, I had pictures of the before and the after and what plants will do from all over the country with this approach. And it's hard to argue with a plant that has 3,000 blooms on it at one time that has been treated this way. And so I know it works. I've seen it work. We've implemented in trials all over the country. And I would rather save that money for more plants than I would buying more products to go in my garage that I may or may not need.
Absolutely. Speaking of choices and things we see on TV, oh man, fertilizers, there's so many choices. So how do we know?
Well, that's a good question. I asked it when I was a young gardener. How in the world do I go to a store that has 3 aisles of fertilizer and know what I need? And I see this in people at the box stores, sitting there agonizing and reading every single label and And you can't help but go up and say, "Can I help you?" and come to find out, they need something very simple, but their cart is half full because they fall victim to the pretty label and the pictures and the claims that this does what nothing else does. And it's very refreshing when someone steps in to offer assistance that doesn't have a stake in the sale. Mm-hmm. And so what I tell people is buying whatever you see on TV or whatever you read in a magazine only works if your soil needs what that product has. And so based on your soil test, if you don't need phosphorus, don't buy it. If you don't need, if you're not going to a rose show and you don't need flowers that are 5 inches across and all the colors in the Crayola box, don't buy that bloom booster. And so what I find, and this is a whole different program, folks. I have a whole program on what makes fertilizers work and not work. Not everything you see on store shelves work as you intend them to work. Most people don't know that, and the fertilizer companies are certainly not going to tell you that. Whether a fertilizer works or not, or is correct for your application, depends on the weather, the time of year it's going to be used, and the condition of your garden that it's going to be used with. If the answer is not, it's right for all three things, it's not right for you. So you have to be kind of careful, and you have to be a little bit analytical, and you have to ask yourself some questions in order to figure out what product is right for you. And I have to say, because this is human nature, if the plant looks sick or it's not doing what we want, we add more fertilizer and we add more water, and we just make our problem worse. So if your plant appears to be sick, or it appears to not be doing what it's supposed to do, the very last thing you want to do is add fertilizer. And I've had people say, well, why? It's supposed to make my plants better. No, that's not the approach. What fertilizer does is boost production. It's like I've got the flu and I've got a marathon coming up in 3 weeks. And I start taking Echinacea, which is a good product, but not for this application. And I expect that Echinacea to make me well enough to run that marathon. Wrong. It may help the flu, but it is not going to help me run the marathon. And so with sick plants, the very last thing that you want to do is take that plant's resources away from overcoming whatever is wrong by forcing it to grow. Because then you put the plant in conflict, and it doesn't know whether I try to get healthy and rest, or do I put out more roots and more flowers even though I'm sick. And then you don't know what caused the plant's demise. Did you force it to grow when it shouldn't have been growing? And so you have to just remember, don't fertilize a sick plant. First figure out why it's sick and get it past that. And then after the first bloom on its own, once it's been sick, then you can fertilize. So what do we fertilize with? Good grief, good night. There's 4 shelves of fertilizer in the stores. There's 2 main types. There's either synthetic fertilizer, which is man-made, or there's organic fertilizer, which is nature-made. Now, by no means am I an organic activist. I believe in using what works, and what works in the amount of time that I have to garden. Because let's face it, I work 90 hours a week in a law firm, and I teach every single weekend somewhere in the United States. So I don't have a lot of time to garden. My garden's got to be pretty much self-sufficient. And I want it to look like a Southern Living magazine when I come home, even though I may not have been home. So there's pros and cons for both synthetics and organics. Within those synthetic and organic classes, there's granular fertilizers and there's water-soluble fertilizers. That part is important. There is no one type of fertilizer that works 100% of the time, no matter what type of year it is and no matter where your garden is located in the country. You are always going to have two different types of fertilizer. Why is that true? Granulars, whether they're synthetic or organic granulars, the best times of year to put those out is when it's not rainy. A couple of years ago, I gave a program in Dallas, Texas, and it was in February, and it was on fertilizers. And first question I said was, let's have some audience participation. How many people in this audience have already fertilized their gardens? And about 80% of the hands went up. And I said, did you buy enough for 2 applications? Because you're going to need a second one because the first one's already gone. And people started looking at me funny, and I said, it's rained 20 inches in Dallas since the 1st of February. I said, where do you think your fertilizer went? Down the drain. So the best time of year for a granular is not when it's during the rainy season wherever you live. Granulars work best when it's a little bit drier and rainfall is at a more moderate level. In Texas, we had 30 inches between February and March. So granulars for Texas is not a good early spring feed. Water solubles, on the other hand, work best when food is immediately necessary for plant health, or when the soil's chemical balance is compromised or has too high of a phosphorus level. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago at the American Rose Center, we were taking out some beds to replant them because the beds were doing very poorly. And the first bed I went to was some David Austin roses. And I noticed that the plant wiggled in its space like a loose tooth. And I'm like, what in the world? Mature plant, 4 foot tall. One hand, I pulled it completely up out of the ground. It had 1 taproot and no feeder roots. I'm like, oh, this is bad. Got a bunch of people on the phone, different universities, took pictures, did a soil test. The saline level of the soil was over 1,000 times too high. So the salt in the granular synthetic fertilizer was eating the plant roots off the plant. Or probably better stated, it was desiccating the plant roots so that they disappeared. Wow. And the only thing the plant was surviving on and not doing very well was a taproot. So what do you do in that case? Because the soil is now so far out of whack, it's going to take a long time to get it fixed. But the plants still need food. And so for those type situations, using a liquid water-soluble fertilizer as a foliar feed fed the plants, but it didn't change the composition of the soil chemistry. So in that type of situation, foliar feeding with water solubles is good. It's also good in the early spring when you don't want your fertilizer to wash off in rainy seasons. You can apply it to the plants as a foliar feed. It will be automatically absorbed into the leaves and taken in the plant and support the food making mechanism of the bush. So there's positive and negatives to both. If you're using water soluble, you may have to use it more often because it's much more diluted than a granular. But as far as economics, this water soluble is typically more economical than the granular. But the granular is certainly easier for people to apply because you stick your hand in the bucket and you throw it. But I tend to gravitate to a use of both, and I match what I'm using to the condition of the garden and the weather at the garden to make my decisions. Now, when do you fertilize? Because a lot of people will go out in January and February down in the South and prune their bushes and fertilize. Well, that could be in the middle of January. Fertilizer's not going to work. It's going to sit there until it washes off. Fertilizers do not work until the soil temperature gets 70 degrees. At 70, the plants wake up and they say, I'm hungry, and they expect food to be there. And so that's why that soil thermometer is important, because as you get into the temperature range where you're almost at 70 on a consistent basis, that's when you would want to put out your fertilizer if it's granular. Because remember, granulars have to decompose before the plant can use them. And that usually takes 3 to 6 weeks from the time you put it out until it reaches the stage that the plant can use it. So roses, we know, heavy feeders take regular applications of fertilizers, but that does not mean all year long. And I get a lot of comments from seasoned rosarians who have grown up knowing you fertilize roses every 30 days. Well, that practice can lead to soils becoming out of whack because you're putting out fertilizer whether you know or not that the soil needs it. But at 90 degrees, roses start shutting down and they stop asking for food. And they try to conserve every bit of energy that they have because they don't know when the water supply is going to get turned off. And that's why the blooms get smaller, you get fewer blooms in the heat of the summer. And at 95, they're just trying to survive. They don't have a thought about creating a flower. So trying to force them to bloom by adding fertilizer when the temperature is that high is counterproductive to the health of the plant. If for people that use my recipe of fertilizer, that does not come into play because it just sits there until the plant needs it. But if you're trying to force feed plants because you want a bigger flower and it's 90 to 95 degrees, plant's just trying to stay alive. It is not trying to do what we want it to do. And sometimes no matter how much water we put on it is not going to overcome that problem that temperature brings into play. So we just need to remember that. And besides fertilizers that all say on their label somewhere N, P, and K, which is the percentage of main active ingredient, there's amendments. And amendments are fertilizer too. In my opinion, amendments are much more economical to use than purchased fertilizers. I even have a secret that's not so secret anymore, fertilizer recipe that uses amendments. It feeds the plant and it feeds the soil for a whole 6 months. So you only have to put it out in the spring and the fall and then not worry about feeding plants after that. So any of your listeners that want that recipe, it's the product, the components of it there's 7 components, and they're very easy to source. Can send an email to you or to me, and I will send them that recipe. But I have had the best luck with that recipe over anything I have ever purchased. And at one point in time, when I was young and I did what everybody told me to do, I was spending $1,200 a year on fertilizer for 200 rose bushes and 1,200 blooming plants. And my husband saw the bill. And he said, "We're not going to do this anymore, are we?" And I immediately said, "No, we're not going to do this anymore." And then as I walked away, I said, "You hadn't done it yet, ever." But I did say, he is right. That is a crazy amount of money to be putting into plant food. And so working with the late Monty Justice and a couple of other good chemists, I came up with this recipe, and it works everywhere, every time. And so it is my go-to how to feed a plant, and I use it for everything, even blueberries and azaleas. But I haven't seen anything it doesn't work well. Now, some do's and don'ts when it comes to fertilizer. Remember, this is a do, the more leaves a plant has, the better it can regulate its temperature and its food supply, because the leaves are where the food is made. So by fertilizing, if you are promoting growth and promoting more leaves, that helps improve the health of the plant. Another do, how often you're going to fertilize depends on the type you use and what the label instructions say. If our August members of our Rose Society say every month, ask what product. Because not every product is a monthly application. And if you're doing that, you're putting more fertilizer and more active ingredients on your soil than your soil needs or can use, and you may ultimately get your soil out of balance, which is what happened at the American Rose Center. They were using 20-20-20 because it was donated for years and years and years, and eventually things didn't do well because there was too much salt in the soil mix. So read the label. Cannot stress that enough, is you read the label on the fertilizer just like you read the label on everything else. You also don't want to apply fertilizer to dry soil, especially if your fertilizer is a granular. Granular fertilizers, the largest percent of ingredients in a granular fertilizer is mineral salt. Salt is not a good thing in dry soils. It tends to dry out the roots of plants. If there is too much of it, it takes a lot of water to carry that salt down past the root zone. So if you're in a drought situation, granular fertilizers are probably not the best thing to use. And if you're not in a drought situation, water your landscape the day before you apply fertilizer. Apply your fertilizer and then water again. And that way you don't run into things are moist enough to make the fertilizer start breaking down right away. You don't want to get that dry fertilizer on the plant because, remember, it's got salt. What does salt do? It draws moisture out of wherever it is. If it's on your leaves, it's going to draw moisture out on the leaves. So if you're using granular fertilizers, it's always a good idea to go back behind yourself and wash the plants off to make sure you didn't get any fertilizer on the leaves and it caused you chemical burn on the leaves. You want to have your fertilizer ready and available to the plants early enough in the spring to jump start them. When it turns 70 and they're looking for food, they want the food to be there. There's where your soil thermometer comes into play. If you're using granulars, you want to have those put out 2 to 3 weeks before the soil turns 70 degrees, and then it will be there when the plant needs it, or you can wait until the soil gets 70 and use a water-soluble fertilizer. Best piece of advice I can give you. This is a don't. Don't put more than the label recommends. More is not better when it comes to fertilizer. This can lead to disastrous results. I am the prime example. I have a country house by College Station that belonged to my in-laws, and it is 250 acres of ranch property. And my mother-in-law was the epitome of, my yard's got to look like Southern Living magazine. And so you start fertilizing them pastures at my yard, and you better be sure you got enough fertilizer left. Come and do it again on your way back. So she was she was forcing the boys to put out twice as much fertilizer as the soil needed. Today, if I do a soil test, my soil is almost as sterile as the Sahara Desert. And it is a battle to grow anything. And it takes a lot of water and a lot of compost. And I have 500 century oak trees that I have to deal with. So more Aubrey Hammond is not better. You want to fertilize according to what the soil needs and not what it doesn't need. If your phosphorus level is fine, you pick a product that does not have phosphorus. If your nitrogen level is too low and everything else is fine, you only may need nitrogen. So buy according to what your soil test says you need and forget about adding anything else unless it's recommended. If your area has a high or borderline level of saline in the irrigation water or in the soil, and down in the South, that's pretty common. In fact, Texas A&M has, where Texas A&M has high saline levels in the water and the soil, because this is pasture land and it is typically irrigated with granular synthetic fertilizers. And there are a lot of times there's not enough water to wash it through. And so that soil accumulates in the soil. Then if that's your situation, you should avoid using granular synthetic fertilizers, because those are made up of mineral salt and you're just adding salt to salt. So that's just for people that are in that particular condition. You don't want to be adding more salt to a product, to a ground situation where salt is already a problem. And then people always ask me, what's your favorite fertilizer? Because we all know that's the easiest way to make your choice when you're at the box store, is not reading all those four shelves of labels. It's get something somebody else uses and it works, okay? My not-so-secret recipe blend works every time, in every situation. There are 2 products that I use, and I will tell you why. These are new products to me. They are not new products to the rose industry, but they are just now being sold to individuals. And they are called Vitazyme, VITYZME, and a product called Myco, MYCOBOOST. Both of these products are made by Vital Earth Resources. Here's why they are the best I have ever found. Vitazyme is a biorational product, and biorationals are just now coming to the forefront for home gardeners. And what they do is they work with the plant's immunity system to boost the plant's immunity so that it is better able to ward off disease and pests. Okay? It's even in the ag industry, it's even used as a seed treatment because seeds treated with Vitazyme typically produce a healthier plant. And they have been used with roses with similar results. MycoBoost, this is for real. At my country house in Navasota, when my husband passed away, I had not been there for almost a year. And as you can imagine, in a rural agricultural setting, the weeds were as tall as the fence. And I had to take a crew up, and we were cutting the weeds and cutting the grass. And one of the men came and got me, and he said, "Miss Hammond, there's a flower." And he said, "It's not a weed, it's a flower." And so I went out in the pasture, and sure enough, there is an Agiritum. And for those of you who don't know what an Agiritum is, if you've ever bought a flower arrangement, it has had an Agiritum in it. They are small powder puff orchid blooms, and they do not grow wild. And there is an Agiritum in this pasture grass. And as we delicately untwine it from the weeds, it's 3 feet long.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how it got out there, nobody knows. But at one point in time, I did have a compost bin, so I probably threw the remnants of a flower arrangement out there, and it seeded, and it got in the grass. I had no pot. The only dirt that I had was a 10-year-old Walmart bag of potting soil that was so old that the bag had disintegrated. I had my man dig it up, put it in the pot. We potted that horrible planting mix, got it to Houston, and it immediately started to die back. It went from 3 feet to 6 inches and 1 leaf in 2 weeks. And I was talking to my friend Mark Chambly, who used to own Chambly's Rose Nursery, and he said, "I'm going to send you something. I wanted you to use it on this plant." And he sent me a bottle of MycoBoost. And I put a half a teaspoon on this pot of 1/6" stem with 1 leaf. And within 3 weeks, I had a pot full of leaves. And I have now divided that pot since October the 20th of last year 3 times into 3-gallon pots each time. And so I went there to MycoBoost, to Vital Earth Resources, and I said, "Why does this work?" and they explained to me that it is a product of mycorrhizae fungi and their proprietary fertilizer mix. Well, I know a lot about mycorrhizae fungi. It's a good fungus that doubles the size of a root system. And so whatever plant you use it on, the root system has more ability to take up food and water than it would have without mycorrhizae fungi. So now I understand why it works. And I gave some to my friend Beverly Welch at the Arbor Gate Nursery, who had a tree that had Phytophthora root rot. She didn't know what to do with it. Everything she had done had not worked. She started treating the tree with Vitazyme and MycoBoost, and the tree survived.
Oh my goodness.
So I don't use nothing else. I gave away every other product in my garage, and as you can imagine, speaking all over the country, a lot of times I get paid in products. They all got donated, and these are the 3 things I use. Mine, my recipe, Vitazyme, and MycoBoost. And I cannot recommend them enough because I've seen them work.
I have never heard of them, but you can imagine that it's going on my list.
Well, put it on your list because it is just, those products are just amazing.
Now, I'm assuming we can buy them online.
They are at independent garden centers.
Okay.
But independent garden centers can purchase from Vital Earth Resources. And if somebody needs a contact, have them get in touch with you or get in touch with me, and I will send them the contact to get them the product at their nursery.
Okay, thanks. Oh, that was so interesting and so helpful. Well, Gaye, in our final moments, let's move to the pretty part. I know it's not supposed to be just the pretty part, but let's move to mulch.
Okay, next to soil, mulch is the next most important thing. The best kind of mulch are shredded hardwood pieces that are 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. And contrary to public opinion, you can use this raw straight off the tree trimming truck as long as you don't mix it in your soil. It is not going to rob the soil of nitrogen. The goal, and people forget this, the goal of mulch is just not to be a pretty product. It's supposed to break down and feed the plants. It's supposed to conserve moisture. It's supposed to moderate soil temperature. And as a result of doing all those good things, it's also supposed to deter weeds. Can you keep weeds from forming? No. But you can deter the amount of weeds that you actually end up having. And I have people say, well, I use rock or I use pine straw because I got pine trees. Those are really not the best mulches for roses. Truth is, rocks, because I have some, rocks are hard to fertilize the ground underneath. My rocks don't get used for that. My rocks get used for putting something in place to keep the dogs out of that pit. And if you're using granular products, they get trapped in the rocks and they don't ever get in the ground. Liquids, if you're using liquid fertilizers as a drench, rocks tend to filter those out. And so rocks don't do good as mulch for roses. I know from experience in public gardens that use pine straw as mulch, it thatches into place and you can pour water on it all day long and the water is just simply going to run off and the ground underneath is going to be just as dry as a bone. Same thing happens with nutrients in pine straw. The goal of your mulch, besides conserving moisture, regulating temperature, and deterring the weeds, is to improve the soil. If you use shredded hardwood mulch, you can expect in year one, the bottom inch of the mulch has decomposed, turned into humus, and the earthworms and the microorganisms that work in the soil. So you have improved your soil by 1 inch in year one. In year two and beyond, every 6 months, you add another layer of improved soil. And in year three, it's possible to dig a straight-sided hole and you will see rings just like in a tree. You'll see 1 inch rings where the bottom one is the darkest and the next one is a little lighter and the next one's a little lighter. And you can tell how many years you've been improving that bed. Mm-hmm. Now, people say, well, I turn my mulch under every year before I add new. That is a terrible approach. Because if you start picking away at your mulch layer, you'll see in there white stringy things. Now, I've had people say it was mushrooms. Well, it's not mushrooms. It's a fungus that decomposes wood. So where your mulch is moist, you'll see these strings of white, and they're doing their job. They're turning that mulch into humus, and then the earthworms come up to the top and get it and take it down and and improve the soil. So you never turn it under. You just simply, at the end of the spring and the summer, or the beginning of the spring and the summer, take a ruler out there and wiggle it around until you get it level with the ruler level with the soil, and see how high the mulch is, and then you add enough mulch to bring that layer up to 3 inches. And that's all you have to do. If you can see your soil, you don't have enough mulch. If you can see your soil, you probably have a whole lot of weeds. So the more mulch you put in, the less weeds you're going to have. In places where the winters are really cold, like under 25, it's even okay to increase your mulch layer to 6 inches as a way to provide more insulation to your soil and to your plants.
Oh my goodness, you've just given us so much great information, Gaye. Thanks so much. You know, we've been friends for years. We've been friends for years, but every time we talk, I'm just amazed at how much I learned from you.
Can I say one thing before we end?
Yeah.
Okay, let me get on the soapbox. Last year during COVID-19, I decided that I was going to create a new bed. And I wanted to get it jump-started because I didn't have time. This was late in the season, and I needed to get some plants in the ground before the winter. I went to the box store, and I bought the prettiest bag I could find, which was improved soil. And it wasn't. It was sawdust. And I went back, and I got more. And then the third trip, I got every one they had. Only one of those bags had real soil in it. Everyone else was full of pine fines or sawdust. So be careful. In my experience, the prettier the picture, the cheaper the product. If the company will not open the bag so you can see it, don't buy it. Because that was a very expensive learning experience for me. And I firmly believe there ought to be legislation. If you're going to say it's soil, it better be soil. But unfortunately, it is not. So buy it from a reputable place that you know it's a good soil product.
I can tell you that is, in my experience, that is so true. You know, I have said to people, what happened to soil? You can't buy topsoil anymore. It's just amazing that you open it up and it looks very similar like a bag of mulch.
That's true. And it can do, if you mix that in, people will look at the label and they'll say, oh, it's got fertilizer in it too. Well, of course it is fertilizer. If you mix that product without fertilizer into your soil, it's going to rob your plants of nitrogen. They're going to die while the sawdust breaks down. So they have to add fertilizer, and it is not a benefit. It's keeping your plants from dying. So open it up and look at it, and if it's not soil, don't get it.
Well, I'm so glad that you got on your soapbox because that is absolutely outstanding information. So, Gaye, thanks so much. I mean, you're just a treasure trove of information for all gardeners, really, but especially for those of us who grow roses.
Well, it's great, my great pleasure, and I can't look forward to getting out in the yard and digging in the dirt now.
Oh, I know. This gets us so excited. Well, friends, if you're like me, you're going to have to put this episode on repeat just to catch it all. I mean, we've gone to class today. Gaye packs in the information, and we're so glad. And until next time, happy gardening from your friends at Rose Chat.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat podcast with Chris Van Cleve and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat Podcast. The Rose Chat Podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.